right, welcome everybody to our enrichment series session today. Understanding IDE requirements. We have Kristen Bussey presenting as well as Betsy Polak. And I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thanks, Sarah. And thanks everybody for joining today. I really don't have that many slides to go through. So certainly, there's always the interest in trying to make things more interactive. So if you have any questions along the way, something isn't necessarily clear after I've gone through it, feel free to put something in the chat. Sarah will keep an eye on that. Otherwise, just come off mute and I'm happy to address any questions. If you do feel like waiting until the end, obviously you can do that as well. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of what the actual definition of a medical device is and how that's important in defining when a study is considered a device study. We'll go through the IDE exemption criteria as well and make sure that you understand the nuanced differences between non-significant risk and significant risk studies. The roles of the sponsor, IRB and FDA, is also important to understand in who is making that risk assessment and ultimately have a study oversight as well. And then we'll finish things up with OCRIC and Betsy's input on the billing compliance to round things out for this institution. All right, so first, before going into whether a study is a device study or not, I also want to point out that it's important to know that most devices that are on the market do not require clinical trials prior to FDA approval. So that is one feature that you need to keep in mind. There's a lot of very low risk medical devices out there that don't need any sort of clinical trial with it. But if you are given a study that includes a device, I highly recommend, if you need to work through these details of whether you need FDA oversight or not, or what regulations apply, that you ask these questions in order. So first one is this really a medical device, or is it a device being used, in some different manner? So we'll go over that definition. We'll talk about how important it is to determine whether the objective of the clinical investigation is to determine the safety or effectiveness of the medical device. That's the second question. And then finally, does the study qualify as IDE exempt? So once you work through these questions, then it'll become more clear which direction you need to go. So let's dive into that a little bit deeper. First question, is it a medical device? So I have here what the definition is according to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so if we start at the top, it's an instrument, apparatus, implement, a thing, right, that is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Those are the key things that you need to consider. And then, is it intended to affect the structure or any function of the body? And then finally, what's highlighted in blue down there, so its primary mode of action or intended purpose isn't through a chemical reaction within the body, so it isn't a drug. It's something else that does not need the human body to work effectively. All right, so moving on to the next question. I split this up into two questions, really. The first one being, is the device involved in a clinical investigation? And so naturally, we need to ask what the FDA definition of a clinical investigation here. So that's what's listed here. Very broad. Clinical investigation is any experiment in which a drug or device is administered, dispensed to, or involving one or more human subjects, unless it's being used in medical practice. So that's where we have to determine, usually this is pretty obvious. Usually the answer is yes, obviously this is a clinical investigation. It's being offered as research, right? So then secondly, the more important question is trying to drill down into what the objective of that clinical investigation is. and to determine whether one of those objectives, because we see all these studies that have primary and secondary objectives, if there is an objective in there that relates to the effectiveness or the safety of that device that's being used, then those regulations that are included in CFR 812 or the IDE regulations, those apply. So that's the intent of this question, is trying to determine whether the CFR 812 IDE regulations apply. So hopefully you know the answer to this question now already. I didn't know, did you create one for this or no? Just the knowledge questions. Okay. Yeah, we do have some Zoom polls that we'll launch a little bit later on. So hopefully everybody is thinking to themselves after my first introduction is like, no, there's no need for FDA to be involved in the oversight of all clinical trials that involve the use of a device. Because like I just said, if the objective of that study is not to test the safety or effectiveness, then these IDE regulations wouldn't apply. And that's where FDA oversight comes in, is with the IDE. And so it could be the first scenario where a device is being used as a tool. Most common example that I go to is whether an MRI is being used in order to determine, whether a tumor is appropriately responding to a drug, potentially. That's what we see all the time in oncology studies, right? So moving on to then the next question is, okay, so if we know this is a device in a clinical trial, does it qualify as an IDE exempt study? So I've got, again, the definition here, which is from the IDE regulations, 21 CFR 812. I've got it referenced there if you ever need to look it up. So here, any of these criteria, if the device meets one of these 6 criteria, then it can be exempt from the IDE regulations. So let's just go over those briefly. So 1, it's a legally marketed device. It's being used in accordance with its labeling. If that's the case, it's exempt. If it's an in vitro diagnostic that meets these 4 specific criteria, I'm not going to go into those because that's a whole separate seminar on IVDs. And if you're interested in more, I can send you a different presentation that I've prepared. So if it meets the IVD exemption criteria, then it can be exempt. Or if it's a device undergoing consumer preference testing or testing modification, or a combination of 2 commercial devices already in distribution, it can be exempt then. And then the last 3 here are custom device for research with lab animals, or solely for veterinary use as well. So those are the IDE exemption criteria. So that brings us to our first knowledge check, and Sarah is going to launch a poll here.
Give me a second to read the bullets. I believe when I launched the question, it should show the same slide.
And I can just read it out loud. So a research team wants to study whether an increasing daily steps improves blood pressure control. And they're doing this by or for adults diagnosed with hypertension with no recent changes in prescribed medications. They're giving these participants a daily tracker, an activity tracker, like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or whatever. They're going to wear that daily for 12 weeks. And then the steps are collected and correlated with the blood pressure readings taken in clinic. So do you think this study requires an IDE?
Yeah, votes are rolling in.
Okay.
So far, we have 100%, about 20 respondents saying no, and nobody is saying yes.
Fabulous. So let's walk through that.
All right.
All right. So you guys nailed it. Does the study require an IDE? 100% no. Okay, so why is that? What's the device? We've got a commercial FDA cleared activity tracker being used according to its intended use. And then they're collecting it for really observational purposes, no treatment decisions or other correlation on its effectiveness or its safety is going to be used. It doesn't appear it's going to be submitted for an FDA application or anything like that. Does it introduce risk to the patients? I would argue no. It's wearable, it's non-invasive. There's no energy delivered into the body. So no, it is IDE exempt. There we go. So that summarizes it. Okay, so moving on then, as far as what your options are when you're evaluating the use of that device. So we just walked through this. It might just be a tool being used. So I use the example of an MRI, could be something that's an IVD to determine whether the minimal residual disease, that's hard for me to say, MRD is, again, in the oncology setting, might be exempt if it meets those criteria, or the IDE regulations might apply. And so it's with that last example there, if the IDE regulations apply, then the next step is to determine whether it's a significant risk study or a non-significant risk study. So that's what we will go through next, is to review what this criteria is. And so why does this matter? The important thing to know here is that a significant risk device study requires a full IDE application to be approved by the FDA and by the IRB, of course. Whereas a non-significant risk device study does not require that full IDE. It just requires approval of the study by IRB after they've made this determination, and it's included in the minutes that it's a non-significant risk device. And one thing I did want to point out also is that note on the bottom of the screen there. It's really important to remember it's not simply the device itself that you're taking a look at the risk of. It's the device used in the context of that clinical trial, and how what is the level of risk that's associated with its use in that context. So the FDA does have this fabulous guidance document. They have guidance for everything. Some of it is clearer than others. I like this one because I feel like it gives a lot of information to IRBs and investigators on how to answer this question of what is considered significant risk versus non-significant risk. So if we take a look at this, one of the key pieces of information they go through is interpreting the regulations. So the significant risk definition comes from, again, the IDE regulations and CFR 812, and they're listed here. So a significant risk device study means that A, it's intended as an implant, presents a potential for serious risk. B, is purported to be sustaining or supporting human life, or there's a serious potential for risk. Or number 3, it's used for substantial importance in diagnosing, curing, mitigating, or treating disease, or otherwise preventing impairment. And then the last one is otherwise presents a potential for serious risk. So that catch-all phrase of how risky is this? So obviously you can see it goes into a lot of what the risk is. And like I said, it's nice to be able to look at this guidance document because they also have examples as well of different scenarios. So in this situation, when we do decide that there's a significant risk associated with the device in that study, then a full IDE is needed to be submitted to the FDA. Conversely, if your study doesn't meet that definition, you can say no to those questions on the previous slide. That means you have an NSR device or non-significant risk device. And that's when you have an abbreviated IDE. So the abbreviated IDE requirements are listed here. Again, comes straight from the regulations. They're pretty easy to comply with, but labeling the device is an important one. Obviously, you're going to have IRB approval And you're going to go through informed consent, just like normal. Monitoring and records are kind of the components there where it's basically in line with what you're already doing with your clinical trial protocol and GCP anyway. So usually not more than that. And then finally, the last piece there is that, obviously there's a prohibition on promoting the device because it's still investigational. All right, so going on, in summary, it really depends on the level of risk associated with the device. And so I just thought I would, display this information a little bit differently so that you can see on the left hand of the diagram, the non-significant risk includes no FDA submission, only IRB oversight. And what you have with that NSR determination at the end of the IRB meeting is an abbreviated IDE versus a full IDE that's needed for a significant risk study. So hopefully that is clear to you. Now, apparently I had that animation off. There we go. Okay, so here's another knowledge check here. So I'll just read through the scenario. This research team wants to compare how accurate two glucose monitoring devices are. In adults with type 2 diabetes, they have device A, device B, both are FDA cleared for continuous glucose monitoring. And what they're doing is having participants also take finger stick glucose checks to verify the readings from their CGM. So does the study require an IDE?
Are coming in.
Okay.
I'm gonna end the poll. You should
Okay.
see the results. One
All
last chance to confirm your answer. Here we go. And I'll share it. There we go.
There we go. Okay, so a little bit split here. So 71% say no, an IDE isn't required, and 29% say yes, an IDE is required. I guess I probably should have specified whether this is an abbreviated or a full IDE as well. So let's walk through the risk determination for this one. So what is the device? It's the continuous glucose monitors or CGMs that are FDA cleared. Are they being used according to their label? Yep. How's the data being used? So I would argue that the effectiveness of the devices are under investigation because you're using a head-to-head comparison of the two CGMs, and then you're validating those results with the comparison of the finger sticks that go along with it. So I would argue that this is not IDE exempt. But it's not significant risk. This would be considered non-significant risk. And so an abbreviated IDE is what would need to be in place for this clinical trial. So those of you who said no and were thinking full IDE, gotcha.
Yes.
I should have clarified.
No, it's a great question. Nonetheless.
Yeah. All right. So moving on. We're going to dig a little bit more into the roles of sponsors, IRBs, and the FDA in the risk assessment and oversight process. All right, so of the three I just mentioned, who makes that initial risk determination? Is it the sponsor, the IRB, or the FDA? We don't have a poll for this one, so just thinking in your head, if those who say it's the sponsor, you would be correct. So it's the sponsor's responsibility to make that initial risk determination and present it to the IRB. Only caveat would be unless the FDA has already made that risk determination for the sponsor. And then the sponsor needs to provide that risk determination to the IRB for them to verify it. So let's go through again the regulations that surround the sponsor responsibilities. So I'm just going to use, let's say that the sponsor is justifying a non-significant risk device rather than SR, because usually that's what we see is the justification that it's not significant risk. So what they need to do is provide this explanation that includes, a description of the device, reports of prior investigations if that's needed, the proposed investigational plan, including enrollment criteria. So these are things that you could ask as an IRB member or as a study coordinator who's getting ready to submit this. Don't be surprised if this information is asked. And clearly a lot of it is just going to be what you need for regular IRB review anyway with the protocol and the device description. So that's the information that the sponsor should then provide to the IRB for their review. If the IRB then agrees that, yes, this study qualifies as an NSR study, then it requires that abbreviated IDE and your sponsor is ready to go start enrollment. However, if IRB isn't quite as convinced or there's some level of disagreement there, then the next best option is to go to the FDA and get their input. This is a little bit different than drugs too. Obviously, we don't have the significant risk versus non-significant risk determination with drugs, but FDA clearly has set out with the Q submission that they want to be contacted for this study risk determination if it's not clear to an IRB. So what does that look like? Contacting the FDA can actually be in two different ways. I think the easier one is the Q submission requesting a study risk determination. It's just less information that needs to be provided to them. You give them device information, you give them a cover letter and highlight the nature of the request, include that protocol in there, and then they will provide a response within 90 days. It is a binding determination once they provide you that. And so that's important to know as well. You can't argue with it once they've weighed in. Another opportunity for FDA to weigh in would be just simply filling out a full IDE submission. And so clearly that's going to take a lot longer, potentially, depending on your device. And the advantage is if they come back and say it's significant risk, you've already got that full IDE approved by the FDA. So all you need to do is submit that determination of the IDE itself to the IRB and you're ready to go. Whereas obviously a Q submission coming back with a risk determination of significant risk, then a full IDE would need to follow that initial Q submission. So those are the two avenues by which you can get FDA input and feedback, and I've helped in both of these situations for investigators at our site. All right, so this is just another summary slide here. Again, just laying it out in a different format. Once the IRB receives that sponsor risk assessment, then if they agree that it's an SR, we've got that abbreviated IDE versus an SR would require a full IDE for the FDA to oversee as well. And so then I believe next we have our friends at Oak Creek, and Betsy, if you want to take over, I can just let me know when you need me to advance the slides.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kristen. Just making sure everybody can still hear me, right?
Yes, we can. Yep.
Okay, great. So go ahead and go on to the next slide. All right. So back in 2014, CMS changed their position and left sponsors the responsibility to submit to CMS for approval of their studies for billing compliance purposes. And so this slide really shows kind of the steps on how that work happens between sponsor and CMS. And so, not going into the specific details, but you can see, CMS reviews under their IDE policy. They work with sponsors for that approval, and then they list that approval out on their website. That's where they communicate and where we double check when we're doing our billing compliance work. And there are some differences between category A and category B devices from a Medicare coverage perspective. Next slide. And then just some billing compliance considerations with devices is how that device is provisioned to the site. IDE category A's have to be provided free by sponsors, but there is opportunity to bill for other services. Where IDE category B's, there are two options. They can be provided free by the sponsor, or the sponsor can work with the site and bill that device as billable to patient insurance. The challenge with billing is that we want to make sure if it is being billed, that we always are working with Freighter OCRIC to manage the ordering, the purchasing, and all of those financial details that need to happen when we're the responsible entity for billing. All right, next slide. And then we've got our coverage guidelines as spelled out by Medicare. So coverage support is really for both category A and category B IDEs. That routine care, if that device procedure is covered for that patient population outside of the trial, oftentimes it will be covered for as routine care inside the trial. The device itself, from a category A perspective, not covered. Category B is going to be covered, and the criteria for that, oftentimes we see category A devices and their procedures be fully funded by the study. And that's really just because the study itself is not considered to be routine care, both from a procedural perspective and from the device perspective. So this just shows it a little bit more cleanly between the two resources. Next slide, please. So this is really key. The steps needed to support billing is MCW research team will work with the sponsor and MCW grants and contracts to create and execute a purchase agreement and supplier agreement. And between MCW grants and contracts and Freighter purchasing, there's some standard terms and conditions that are spelled out for that purchase order. And if there's any challenge with that, our friends over in supply chain, they know that they need to get back to us and let us know if there's any challenges, and we work with grants and contracts to get through that. And then research team provides the cost to us so that we know what to charge for that device. And then we in OCRIC work with the charge build team, the clinical department, and supply chain and purchasing to make sure that we can operationalize that plan. So just key takeaway, when the IDE is being billed to patient insurance, just remember to work closely and collaboratively with OCRIC so we can make sure the right workflows are followed for Freighter. Next slide. All right, so we've got your knowledge check.
Yeah, thank you so much, Betsy, for providing
You're
that overview of billing.
Yeah, you're welcome. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them after the end of the presentation.
All right. So we have our next question here. It looks like Sarah launched it. When is a clinical investigation considered a device study under 21 CFR 812? A, when a device is used anywhere in the study. B, when the objective is to assess the safety and or effectiveness of the device. C, when the device is FDA approved. Or D, when the study involves human subjects. Results coming in.
Yeah, still got a few coming in. All right, I'm gonna end the poll here and share. There we go.
Awesome. Yes, when the objective is to assess the safety and or effectiveness. So yes, that is when a study would be considered a device study. Good job there. All right, next one. Who's responsible for making the initial significant risk or non-significant risk determination? FDA, IRB, sponsor, or principal investigator? The next one. Oh, you're working on it. Okay. Sarah's working on it.
Couple of steps
More-
here. We
more
got this
clicks.
launched in Zoom. There we go. Results are coming in quick on this one.
I bet.
Just ended it.
Okay, so 100% said the sponsor. So in the scenario where you have an IIT study, we've got a sponsor investigator. Clearly, that's going to be the investigator in their sponsor role would need to provide that justification. All right, last one here is if a study qualifies for an IDE exemption, 21 CFR 812 does not apply, but the study may still need to comply with 21 CFR 50 and 56 if it is FDA regulated. True or false? In there?
More coming in.
Okay,
All right, I'm gonna end the poll.
all right. And the results are, there we go. Most people said true. Yes, it is true. In the event that you have an IDE exempt study, but it's still a clinical investigation that involves some sort of FDA management or, so it's like a clinical trial with a drug, but you're also using a device, still your FDA regulations are certainly going to apply there. Other scenarios too. And yeah, I think that sums things up for us today. I wanted to also just open it up for anybody who might have experience with devices, share any pitfalls that you might have experienced or anything you've learned along the way.
Kristen, I did just want to take one more moment to say that OCRIC has been working with prevention contracts on a checklist for device studies. And so we hope to be able to publish that soon, but it really helps to kind of spell out all the steps that need to be taken when operationalizing those studies on the freighter side. So we hope researchers will find that helpful. And we'll message that out via the usual channels once it's available.
Okay, fantastic. That's great to know. I'm sure that will be well received once it's done.
Does anybody have any questions also? And again, you're welcome to share any experiences or pitfalls with the group. It's a pretty solid session today.
It was pretty straightforward information, certainly I'm happy, always available to anybody who has any questions about drugs or devices when they are involved in clinical trials. So got my email address there. If something does come up, happy to answer any questions. And these slides, I think, will be available. I had a couple of updates. So Sarah's going to put a new version of these slides in, you said box, right?
Yep. So I just dropped the link again. If you are a reoccurring attendee, you probably have been in that link many times, but there it is again. It's the same link that has all of our current presentations. It also has all of our old presentations that are archived. So all of the current presentations will be just in the main folder. And then I think we started this series in 2023. So all of those are going to be in a archive folder at the top. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining.
Thanks everybody.
And we hope to see you next time.